the Andraxian Imperial Academy of Advanced Sciences occupied 17 floating platforms above the capital city of Draxos Prime, each platform dedicated to a different field of study that the Andraxians had graciously decided to master on behalf of the lesser species of the galaxy. Because, naturally, when your civilization has controlled 47 star systems for the past 6 centuries, you develop a certain, let's call it, confidence that your way of understanding the universe is the correct way. The only way, really. The Academy's reputation stretched across known space like a particularly aggressive marketing campaign. Andraxian scholars had written 93% of all peer-reviewed xenobiology texts, 78% of astrophysics theoretical frameworks, and 100% of the papers explaining why Andraxian methodologies were superior to everyone else's. They were very thorough about that last part. To attend the Academy as a non-Andraxian was considered either a tremendous honor or a catastrophic mistake, depending on whether you asked the scholarship recipients or the students who actually had to sit next to them. The Andraxians accepted exactly 50 off-world students per cycle, carefully selected from species they deemed sufficiently advanced to benefit from proper education. Species with adequate bone density, respectable calcium-based skeletal structures, and most importantly, the kind of planetary gravity that produced beings who could walk through the Academy's corridors without requiring mobility assistance. Deathworlders need not apply, the unofficial policy went. At least, that had been the policy until the Terran Confederation had made such a diplomatic fuss about equal educational opportunities that the Academy had reluctantly accepted one human student, just to shut everyone up. That human currently sat in the back row of Advanced Xenobiology 4-1, taking notes on a datapad while Professor Kilrax droned on about the evolutionary advantages of exoskeletal structures. Her name was irrelevant to most of her classmates, who referred to her as either the human or that thing from the gravity well. She'd heard both. She'd smiled at both. She'd done absolutely nothing about both, which somehow made it worse for the students who'd expected her to crack under the social pressure and request a transfer back to whatever primitive institution existed on Earth. 3 months into the semester, she'd maintained a perfect score on every examination, contributed meaningfully to every laboratory session, and hadn't once complained about the cafeteria's complete inability to accommodate her species' dietary requirements. She'd simply started bringing her own meals, which she ate quietly while reading ahead in the textbooks that Professor Kilrax assigned. The other students found this deeply unsettling. The exoskeletal advantages are clear, Professor Kilrax continued, his 4 arms gesturing at the hollow projection of a Vraxian warrior beetle. Structural integrity without the vulnerability of exposed flesh, natural armor plating that regenerates, and the capacity to survive in variable atmospheric conditions without technological assistance. This is the pinnacle of evolutionary design, the result of 70 million years of... A hand rose in the back row. Professor Kilrax's primary eyes narrowed. His secondary eyes, which had been scanning his notes, swiveled to focus on the source of this interruption. The human. Of course, it was the human. Yes? He asked, in a tone that suggested he was already regretting acknowledging her existence. With respect, Professor, that's factually incorrect, she said, her voice carrying the kind of polite cheerfulness that made everyone in the lecture hall tense up. The Vraxian exoskeleton doesn't regenerate. It molts. And during the molting period, which lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 solar days, depending on environmental factors, the Vraxian in question is actually more vulnerable than species with endoskeletal structures because the new exoskeleton requires approximately 48 hours to fully harden. During that window, a Vraxian has roughly the structural integrity of, well, pudding. The lecture hall went silent. Not the comfortable silence of students absorbing information, but the horrified silence of witnesses to a social catastrophe. Professor Kilrax's chitinous faceplates shifted in what might have been surprise, or might have been indigestion. That is an oversimplification of a complex biological process. It's actually a direct quote from your own textbook, Chapter 14, page 307. The human replied, still smiling. I can show you if you'd like. I have it bookmarked. Several students made sounds that might have been gasps or might have been their species' equivalent of nervous laughter. One student, a Zephyrian with excellent hearing, whispered to his neighbor that he could literally hear the human's heartbeat, and it hadn't increased at all. She was calm, completely, terrifyingly calm. From the third row, a voice cut through the tension like a plasma blade through tissue paper. Perhaps the human is confused because her species never evolved past the endoskeletal stage, the voice said, dripping with the kind of aristocratic disdain that required at least 3 generations of inherited wealth to properly cultivate. It's understandable. When your homeworld's evolutionary pressures were so primitive that your ancestors spent millions of years running after injured prey until the prey died of exhaustion, sophisticated biological concepts might seem challenging. The speaker rose from his seat with the fluid grace of someone who'd never experienced self-doubt. Vexar Thornridge III, heir to one of Andraxos Prime's oldest noble houses, member of the Academy's champion combat debate team, and owner of facial features that suggested his gene line had been optimized for looking down on others. He stood at nearly 7 feet tall, his exoskeleton polished to a reflective sheen, his forearms crossed in a configuration that his species had refined over centuries to express maximum condescension. I mean no offense, Vexar continued, which was how everyone knew he absolutely meant offense. But perhaps this discussion would benefit from participants who actually understand the material at a level beyond. How did the admissions committee describe the human application? Ah, yes, rudimentary, but enthusiastic. The human turned in her seat to look at him directly. Her expression didn't change. The smile remained exactly where it was, the same polite, pleasant smile she'd worn since the beginning of the semester, which somehow made it worse. None taken, she said. I appreciate you sharing your perspective, even if that perspective is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of comparative evolutionary biology. Vexar's exoskeleton actually creaked. The acoustics in the lecture hall were good enough that everyone heard it, that tiny sound of chitin contracting as his muscles tensed beneath. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his voice dropping to a frequency that his species typically reserved for issuing dueling challenges. I have studied xenobiology since I was a juvenile. My family has produced 17 published scholars in this field. My great-grandfather literally wrote the dissertation that established modern exoskeletal superiority theory. And you, a human, from a planet so backwards that your species still experiences involuntary system failures called hiccups, dare to suggest that I misunderstand. Yes, she said simply. You misunderstand. The lecture hall had progressed beyond silence into some new acoustic territory that didn't have a name yet. Professor Kilrax looked like he wanted to interrupt, like he wanted to restore order and academic dignity to his classroom. But he also looked like he wanted to see where this was going, which spoke volumes about the quality of entertainment available on Andraxos Prime. Vexar descended the lecture hall steps with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd practiced dramatic entrances. Each footfall echoed. Each movement was calculated. By the time he reached the demonstration arena at the front of the classroom, he'd generated enough theatrical tension to power a small starship. "Since you seem so confident in your understanding," he said, "perhaps you'd be willing to participate in an academic demonstration. We could examine, practically, the differences between superior evolutionary design and—" He paused, looking her up and down with all four eyes. Whatever Earth produced. The human closed her datapad. She stood up, and the movement was so casual, so completely unbothered, that several students later reported feeling genuine fear for Vexar's sake. Not because they thought the human would win, but because they thought she genuinely didn't understand the danger she was in. "An academic demonstration," she repeated, walking down the steps toward the arena. "You mean the formal challenge protocol outlined in the Academy's Student Conduct Handbook, Section 7, Subsection 3, where students may resolve academic disputes through practical application of xenobiological principles." Vexar's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. "Precisely. I see you've at least learned to read." "I have," she agreed, stepping into the arena. "I've also read the medical liability waiver that participants are required to acknowledge, the emergency medical protocols that the Academy keeps on standby for exactly these situations, and the interesting statistical footnote that mentions how these challenges have been issued 47 times in the past decade, with a 100% victory rate for Andraxian participants." She stretched her arms above her head, rolling her shoulders in a movement that looked entirely too relaxed. "Funny how that works out." Professor Kilrax moved to his podium, activating the arena's medical monitoring systems with the resigned air of someone who'd seen this exact scenario play out before. "Both participants acknowledge this is a non-lethal academic demonstration intended to illustrate practical applications of xenobiological principles." "Acknowledged," Vexar said immediately. "Acknowledged," the human said, still stretching. "Medical scanning is active, emergency response team is on standby, and all students are reminded that recording devices are prohibited during formal academic challenges due to—" Professor Kilrax glanced at his notes. Previous incidents that resulted in viral distribution and significant damage to the Academy's reputation. Several students sheepishly deactivated their datapads. Vexar moved to the center of the arena, his forearms flexing in sequence, each movement showcasing the complex musculature beneath his exoskeleton. "Since you're clearly unfamiliar with how these demonstrations proceed, I'll explain. We each have the opportunity to describe our species' biological advantages before the practical portion begins. This ensures the educational value of the exercise." "How thoughtful," the human said, moving to stand opposite him. The size difference was absurd. Vexar towered over her, outweighed her by at least 100 pounds, and had twice as many limbs to work with. "I'll begin," Vexar announced, because of course he would. "The Andraxian skeletal structure provides superior protection through chitinous plating that distributes impact force across the entire body. Our four-armed configuration allows for multiple simultaneous actions, giving us tactical advantages in any physical confrontation. Our muscle density is approximately 40% greater than baseline humanoid species, and our reaction time has been documented at 0.03 seconds, among the fastest in known space." He paused, clearly expecting applause, or at least impressed murmuring. He got neither. "Additionally," he continued, slightly deflated, "our evolutionary history as pursuit predators on a high-gravity world has optimized our species for sustained physical confrontation. We possess redundant organ systems, enhanced healing factors, and pain tolerance that allows us to function through injuries that would incapacitate lesser species. We are, in every measurable way, designed for survival." The human nodded along like he was describing the weather. That's very impressive. Your turn done? Vexar's mandibles twitched. Your turn. Right, she said, rolling her neck in a way that produced several concerning popping sounds. Humans come from a death world, which I'm sure you know, because it's mentioned in literally every conversation anyone has about my species. Earth has inconsistent gravity fields depending on latitude, extreme temperature variations, unpredictable weather patterns, and an atmosphere that's technically toxic to about 40% of known species. She started walking in a small circle, and Vexar's eyes tracked her movement with the focus of a predator, or what he thought was a predator. Our evolutionary path was weird, she continued conversationally. We didn't develop natural armor because we kept changing environments too fast for any single defensive adaptation to be worth the energy cost. We didn't develop venom because we figured out tools instead. We didn't develop enhanced healing because we developed complex social structures where injured members could be protected while they recovered. So, you're admitting your species is inferior? Vexar interrupted. I'm admitting my species is weird, she corrected. We're pursuit predators like you, except we took it to a really uncomfortable extreme. We can run for hours, literally hours. Our ancestors would just jog after prey animals until the prey died of exhaustion, which is possibly the most horrifying hunting strategy that evolution ever produced. And yet, it worked. We're not fast. We're not strong. We're just relentlessly, impossibly persistent. She stopped moving, standing perfectly still now. We also developed really good pattern recognition because we needed to track prey across enormous distances, which means we're excellent at reading body language and predicting movement. And because we're social creatures who spent millennia trying to figure out if that rustling in the grass was a predator or just wind, we developed anxiety as a survival trait. Anxiety, Vexar repeated flatly. You're listing mental illness as an evolutionary advantage? I'm listing constant threat assessment as an evolutionary advantage, she said. The fact that it makes us deeply uncomfortable in modern society is just a side effect. But in a confrontation, she smiled wider. It means I've been running approximately 40 different scenarios for how this fight could go since the moment you opened your mouth. And I've already identified the 3 points on your exoskeleton that will cause temporary paralysis if struck with sufficient force. The lecture hall, which had been silent before, somehow became more silent. Vexar laughed. Actually laughed. A clicking, chittering sound that his species used to express genuine amusement. You think you've identified vulnerabilities in Andraxian anatomy? That's adorable. We've been warriors for 10,000 years. Every weak point has been reinforced. Every gap in our armor has been closed through either evolution or genetic optimization. Sure, the human agreed. But you optimized for fighting other Andraxians. You've been at the top of your food chain for so long that you forgot what it's like to face something that doesn't fight fair. Then by all means, Vexar said, dropping into a combat stance that had been perfected over centuries. Demonstrate your understanding of xenobiology. The human moved first, which surprised everyone. She didn't charge, didn't throw a wild punch, didn't do any of the clumsy, emotional things that the spectating students expected from a species known for aggression. She took 3 quick steps to the side, and Vexar pivoted to track her. And in that pivot, she closed the distance. Her hand shot out, not in a punch, but in a precise strike to the joint between Vexar's upper and lower left arm. The exact spot where the exoskeleton separated to allow for articulation. Vexar's arm went numb instantly, dropping to his side as his neural pathways misfired. He swung with his right arms, and she wasn't there anymore. She dropped low, sweeping under his swing, and her leg extended in a movement that looked more like dance than combat. Her foot connected with the back of his knee, the specific point where Andraxian legs bent, and Vexar stumbled. Not fell, stumbled. His other 3 arms were already compensating, reaching for her, and she moved again. This time she moved forward instead of away, inside his reach where his long arms were actually a disadvantage, and her elbow came up in a short, brutal arc that connected with the soft neural cluster at the base of his neck. Every species has them. Those little gaps in the armor, those necessary vulnerabilities where the nervous system has to interface with the brain, where blood vessels have to reach the surface, where evolution made compromises between protection and functionality. Humans, who'd spent millions of years trying to kill each other with nothing but rocks and pointed sticks, had become very, very good at finding those gaps. Vexar's entire body seized, not from pain, though that was certainly involved, but from a complete systemic neurological overload. Every muscle contracted at once, his exoskeleton locked up, and he toppled forward like a statue someone had pushed over. He hit the arena floor with a sound like dropping a bag of gravel, and then he just lay there, conscious but completely unable to move, his eyes wide with shock in his mandibles, frozen mid-click. The human stepped back, breathing slightly harder than before, but not winded, not even close to winded. "The neural cluster at the base of the Andraxian neck," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent lecture hall, "is protected by overlapping chitin plates that provide excellent defense against direct strikes from the front or sides. But from below, at a 45-degree angle, there's approximately a 2-centimeter gap where the plates meet. Strike that gap with sufficient force, and you trigger a system-wide neural cascade that results in temporary full-body paralysis, lasting anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, depending on the individual's neurology." She looked at Professor Kilrax. "That's in chapter 23 of your textbook. Page 512. There's a diagram and everything." The medical team rushed into the arena with scanners already active, checking Vexar's vital signs while he lay there, paralyzed and humiliated in equal measure. The lead medical technician, a Ziltharian with 6 arms and the tired expression of someone who'd seen this exact scenario before, looked up at Professor Kilrax. "No permanent damage," the technician reported. "Full mobility should return within 90 seconds. Recommend ice packs for the bruising and perhaps a significant blow to his ego. But that's outside my medical expertise." Vexar's eyes, the only part of him that could move, tracked the human as she walked calmly back to her seat. She picked up her datapad, opened it, and went back to reading the assigned chapter. As if she hadn't just dismantled a trained Andraxian warrior in front of 50 witnesses. Professor Kilrax cleared his throat, which was impressive considering he didn't technically have a throat. "Well, that was educational. I believe we've all learned something valuable today about the importance of understanding xenobiology from multiple perspectives." One student, brave or stupid enough to break the silence, raised a tentacle. "Professor, what exactly did we learn?" Professor Kilrax looked at Vexar, who was beginning to twitch as feeling returned to his extremities. He looked at the human, who was highlighting something on her datapad with the focus of someone who hadn't just committed social homicide. He looked at the lecture hall full of students who would absolutely tell everyone they knew about what they'd just witnessed. "We learned," he said carefully, "that evolutionary advantages are contextual, and that assumptions based on physical appearance can be misleading." The human didn't look up from her datapad, but her smile got slightly wider. By the time Vexar could stand again, his exoskeleton had developed several stress cracks from the impact with the floor. His pride had been ground into powder, and his academic reputation had been thoroughly dissected in front of his peers. He limped back to his seat without looking at anyone, which was difficult considering he had 4 eyes, and they generally pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. The lecture continued. Professor Kilrax covered respiratory adaptations in methane atmosphere species, and everyone took notes like their lives depended on it. Because suddenly xenobiology had become much more interesting when it included practical applications that could make a 7-foot warrior collapse like a puppet with cut strings. After class, the human packed her datapad, gathered her materials, and headed for the door. She was stopped by a small delegation of students, representatives from 3 different species that were also considered lesser by Andraxian standards. A Taraxian whose homeworld had slightly lower gravity than the Academy standard. A Quilix whose species was classified as prey animals on their planet of origin. A Veltorian who'd been mocked in previous semesters for their species' lack of natural defensive capabilities. "That was incredible," the Taraxian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know where to strike?" The human shrugged. "I read the textbooks. All the information is right there. Everyone knows these things in theory, but nobody seems to think the knowledge applies in practice." "But you weren't afraid," the Quilix added. "He's Vexar Thornridge. His family is legendary. He's trained since childhood for physical confrontation. And you didn't even hesitate." "Fear is useful," the human said. "It keeps you alert. But it's also just a chemical reaction, and chemical reactions can be managed. Besides, being afraid of him would have required me to respect him. And frankly, anyone who bases their self-worth on their species' evolutionary path isn't worth respecting." The Veltorian, who'd been silent until now, spoke in a trembling voice. "Do you think... could other species learn to do what you did?" The human considered this. "Depends on your anatomy. But yeah, probably. Every species has vulnerabilities. Every species has strengths. The trick is understanding both and not letting anyone convince you that their strengths are more valid than yours." She glanced back at the lecture hall, where Vexar was being helped to his feet by concerned classmates who were definitely not taking holophotos of his stress cracks. The Andraxians aren't wrong that their evolution produced effective warriors. But they forgot that evolution doesn't stop. It doesn't have a finish line. And it definitely doesn't care about your noble lineage or your family's academic reputation. News of the incident spread through the Academy's social networks with the speed and enthusiasm of a viral plague. By evening, students in completely different departments had heard increasingly exaggerated versions of the story. Some versions claimed the human had killed Vexar and then brought him back to life just to prove a point. Others suggested she'd moved so fast that she'd broken the sound barrier in the lecture hall. One particularly creative version involved the human revealing she'd been wearing gravity weights the entire semester and had only just taken them off. The actual truth, captured in the medical team's official report, was somehow more devastating than the rumors. Human student utilized standard anatomical knowledge to neutralize Andraxian opponent through precise application of force to documented neural vulnerability. Technique was textbook perfect, literally. She cited the page number. The administration called an emergency meeting. The Terran Confederation's liaison officer received 14 urgent messages asking if this was normal human behavior. The answer, hilariously, was, "Sometimes depends on the human." Vexar himself spent the evening in his dormitory, staring at the ceiling and processing several uncomfortable revelations about himself, his species, and the fundamental nature of academic superiority. His family's emergency holocom remained unanswered. He wasn't ready to explain to his 17 published scholars' family tree that he'd been defeated by a human who'd simply done the assigned reading. The human, meanwhile, went to the cafeteria, ate her pre-packed meal in peaceful silence, and then went to the library to study for next week's examination on comparative respiratory systems. She found a quiet corner, activated her datapad, and lost herself in diagrams of gas exchange membranes. She was interrupted once by a nervous Zephyrian student who wanted to ask if she'd really meant what she said about every species having strengths and weaknesses. She'd looked up from her studying, considered the question with genuine thought, and answered honestly. "Evolution is a response to environmental pressure," she'd said. "Your species evolved exceptional auditory processing and threat detection because you needed it to survive. That's not weakness. That's specialization. The problem isn't what you evolved. The problem is letting other people define what counts as strong." The Zephyrian had left looking thoughtful, and the human had returned to her studying. 3 weeks later, Professor Kilrax's advanced xenobiology course had a waiting list for the first time in Academy history. Students from across the Academy wanted to enroll, wanted to see if the rumors were true, wanted to witness what happened when someone actually took the material seriously instead of treating it as theoretical knowledge. The human maintained her perfect scores. She answered questions when called upon. She never mentioned the incident with Vexar, never brought it up, never used it as social currency or leverage. Vexar, for his part, returned to class after a week of medical leave for stress-related carapace damage. He sat in a different seat, asked fewer questions, and developed what observers would later describe as a concerning habit of actually reading the assigned materials before class. The two of them never spoke directly again. They existed in the same academic space, breathing the same recycled atmosphere, studying the same xenobiological principles, and pretending that nothing had fundamentally shifted. But it had. The Academy's unofficial hierarchy, the one based on species prestige and evolutionary optimization and who had the most impressive exoskeleton, had developed a crack. A small one, a crack exactly 2 centimeters wide, at a 45-degree angle, right where nobody had thought to look. Other non-Andraxian students started asking more questions in class, started challenging assumptions, started treating the textbooks as practical manuals instead of theoretical exercises. The Andraxian students, confronted with peers who suddenly refused to accept their species' superiority as given fact, had to actually defend their positions with evidence, which, ironically, made everyone's education significantly better. Professor Kilrax's teaching evaluations that semester included comments like, "Finally learned something practical," and "Never knew xenobiology could be applied to real situations," and one particularly honest review that simply said, "The human scared me into actually studying." The administration eventually released a carefully worded statement about how the Academy valued diverse perspectives and encouraged all students to engage thoroughly with their coursework. And everyone understood what they really meant. "Please stop issuing formal challenges to the human. We're running out of medical supplies." Vexar Thornridge III graduated 3 years later with honors, a completed thesis on the evolutionary advantages of cross-species collaborative techniques, and a much quieter demeanor than he'd entered with. He never issued another formal challenge. He also never forgot the sound his exoskeleton made when it hit the arena floor, or the casual way the human had cited a page number while he lay paralyzed. The human graduated top of her class, was offered research positions at 17 different institutions, and politely declined all of them to return to Earth. Her stated reason was that she missed the food, but everyone suspected she just missed a planet where the gravity felt right, and people didn't assume their evolutionary path was the only valid one. The Academy kept accepting human students after she left. One per cycle, carefully selected, extensively evaluated. The application requirements now included a note. Human applicants should be prepared for rigorous academic challenges and must complete a basic orientation on appropriate use of species-specific anatomical knowledge. Everyone understood what that really meant too. In the end, the Andraxian Imperial Academy of Advanced Sciences maintained its reputation as one of the finest educational institutions in known space. They still published 93% of xenobiology texts and 78% of astrophysics frameworks and 100% of papers about their own superiority. But buried in Chapter 23, page 512 of the latest edition of Professor Kilrax's textbook, there was a new footnote. It read, "Theoretical knowledge of xenoanatomy becomes practical knowledge when applied with precision. Students should remember that understanding biological systems requires acknowledging that all species, including one's own, possess both advantages and vulnerabilities. Ignoring either is academically irresponsible and, as documented in Case Study 7-3b, potentially embarrassing." Case Study 7-3b was never explicitly detailed in the textbook, but every student who enrolled in advanced xenobiology heard the story during their first week. The story of the human who'd done the reading, understood the material, and applied her knowledge with the kind of precision that turned academic theory into a 7-foot warrior, lying face down on an arena floor. The story always ended the same way, with a reminder that evolution doesn't care about prestige, and knowledge is only superior if you actually know how to use it. And somewhere on Earth, a former student occasionally received messages from former classmates, asking questions about human combat techniques or anatomical vulnerabilities, or how to defend themselves against species that assumed superiority. She always answered. Always polite, always thorough, always ending with the same advice. Read the textbooks. All the information is already there. You just have to believe it applies to you too. Because in the end, that was the real lesson. Not that humans were superior, or that Andraxians were inferior, or that any species' evolutionary path was more valid than another's. The lesson was that knowledge becomes power when you have the courage to treat it as practical instead of theoretical. When you stop letting other people define your limitations, and when you remember that even the most impressive exoskeleton has gaps. You just have to know where to look, and maybe, occasionally, be willing to cite the page number while your opponent regains feeling in their extremities. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.